Today we are going to be covering website security for civil society organizations and nonprofits. And as Patricia said, I'm Brian, and I'm actually based in Nairobi, Kenya. And I'm very curious about where some of you are from. So please feel free to pop in the chat where you are joining us today from. Just let us know which city or which country you're joining from. I think that would also be great information for us to have. But on the agenda for today, we've already done some welcome and introductions. And as you tell us the city you're from, it may be great to also introduce yourself, connect with other people. So give us your name, give us your city, give us all that information that you may be willing to share. And for today's agenda, we are going to go straight into common vulnerabilities in websites. And then we are also going to cover website protection measures. And then we will do like a very basic introduction to incident response. And we are going to cover like some 3 scenarios and how to essentially respond to those. And then we'll try open a space for questions and answers. And then my colleague Natalie will cover the next steps and also some resources for you. And one of the other things as well is that based on this particular session, we are also going to provide sort of like a website security checklist for you as well. So please keep that in mind. And we'll also share with you the slides, and you should feel comfortable to reuse the content of the slides, even for your own trainings, or just translate them or adapt them or even remix them for any future trainings on your end or for your communities. So yeah, that permission is there for you as well to take advantage of. Before we get into the vulnerabilities themselves, we have such a diverse audience here, and it's very, very important for you to understand what your website type is. And essentially, we are going to be having recommendations as we go with regards to the website type that you have. And that essentially is where we are going to be starting the conversation of today from. So we do have different kinds of websites, and the first kind is a managed service. And this is where you may have a website, a technical service provider, such as a cloud service provider, handling all the technical infrastructure, which essentially means that on your end, the only thing that you have to do is managing the application layer of the website itself. And this essentially means that you do not handle any security of the server itself. You don't access the server, but you essentially just access your website. So, for example, if it's a WordPress website, you access the login page of the WordPress application, and your responsibility as a client or a consumer is essentially just to make sure the plugins are up to date, or making sure like the themes are up to date. And that essentially means that you have very limited control with regards to what has been hosted in that particular server. And we do have something called a shared responsibility model. And in real sense, what it essentially means is that when someone, for example, is giving you a managed service, like for example, it's a one-click WordPress install or a service such as Wix, it essentially means that Wix essentially takes care of the server or all the security configurations and all the firewalls. And you, as a consumer or the client, you're responsible for handling the security of the platforms itself. So we do have multiple examples. Like, for example, we have Bluehost, we have WP Engine, we even have like a cloud service provider called DigitalOcean. And they have, like, as an example, a managed WordPress service. And on the flip side of that, we have something called a self-hosted model. And this is where you have access to essentially your own server and your own hosting package. So what normally happens in a self-hosted situation is that you get into like a cloud platform such as DigitalOcean or even Linode.Akamai and provision something we call a virtual private server. And that essentially means that you have control to this private server, and then you're responsible for all the security and technical setup of that particular website. So, for example, you would be responsible for making sure the server is up to date. You'd be responsible for setting up the firewall of that particular server. You'd be responsible for all the maintenance tasks, like, for example, if updated packages of the operating system have been released, you'd essentially be responsible for making sure that everything is up to date. And an example of this is just essentially hosting your WordPress website on DigitalOcean or Linode. So that's sort of like the main difference between the two models. Like in one, you have less admin overhead because all the security aspects have been managed for you. And in the other one, you essentially have full control. And with most organizations that we work with, I think it's always split down the middle, where we find that the bigger the organization, the more, in some instances, they're inclined to self-host their tools, and like more sort of like smaller and mostly grassroots organizations, they sort of like resort to managed services because in some instances they also don't have like dedicated IT personnel in their teams. So no approach is perfect in that sense. And we also have other sort of like subcategories of websites. And we have websites that are powered by content management systems and websites that we refer to as static websites. So a content management system is simply a system that exists to make it very easy for users to essentially create or update content on digital platforms. And I'm sure most of you have interacted with WordPress as a CMS. And actually, WordPress is super popular. It powers at least over 43% of the internet, right? And we also have like other CMSs as well, such as Drupal and Joomla. But for most, from my experience, most of the organizations that we interact with actually in the space use WordPress. And content management systems actually come with their own sort of like sets of risks. Like, for example, last year, more than 8,000 new vulnerabilities surfaced in the WordPress ecosystem, between the plugins, the themes, and also the WordPress versions themselves. And also, there's been an issue in WordPress lately where developers are sort of like abandoning plugins and themes. So that essentially means that users are not getting the updates that they should be getting. And eventually, as users update their WordPress versions, we also have some issues with some old plugins not being compatible with like newer WordPress versions, leading to like breakages. But we're going to be speaking more into these specifics shortly. So do let us know in the chat. Do you use like a CMS? Do you use WordPress? Do you self-host your website, or do you essentially use like a managed service? Yeah, share that information in the chat. I think it would be lovely to know. And for a non sort of like CMS or a static site, essentially they're actually very, very easy to host. And you can actually host them for free as well. On so many sort of like services, like for example, GitHub Pages, you can host it for free there. There's also a service called Cloudflare Pages that would sort of like allow you to host it for free. And then Vassal. Vassal is a form of, it's sort of like a serverless platform that just makes it super easy for you to be able to like host static websites. Like, for example, all you'd have to do is like import your repository onto Vassal, and it's just going to like handle the building process for you. So for non-technical teams, we've been seeing a lot of them use Vassal for like hosting easy websites and lots of like static websites. But the issue with static websites is that they can be harder to update, because in most instances, when you're updating it, you're either changing HTML code or adding CSS code if you want to do like some styling. And also in some instances, you could also be like adding markdown content. So that essentially means that most of the people who handle static sites are those people who essentially are more tech savvy. And if you're multiple people managing a static site, then something like version control would be very important as an example to prevent conflicts. So do let us know, like, how do you host your website, and do you self-host it yourself? Is your website powered by a CMS? And if so, which one? And do you have any concerns about them? I think that would be very cool information to have. But yeah, now that we sort of like understand, the kinds of websites that we use, we are going to specifically talk about the general sort of like infrastructure risks. And the first thing is, as I've mentioned, is outdated software. So from the screenshot here, you can see that 59% of plugins have been abandoned for 2+ years, according to W3 Techs. This essentially means that more than 34,000, as an example, WordPress plugins have not been updated in over 2 years. And the worst part about this is that for some of these organizations, they actually need some of these plugins because their websites depend on them. So by default, it puts them in a situation where they're dependent on plugins that may be vulnerable. So we have been seeing, and we've been doing a lot of like penetration tests and vulnerability scans. And from our end, we've constantly been surfacing organizations that just have so many outdated plugins and outdated themes, or even just outdated WordPress versions, right? And in some instances as well, we've seen organizations that their websites are running on really like outdated, for example, with WordPress as an example, outdated like PHP versions. So we've been seeing a lot of that. And also for those who are self-hosting, when we carry out like vulnerability scans, we sometimes surface outdated server software. So we just look at, sometimes we get their server to like expose, for example, the versions of SSH that they're running, or we see they're running like on operating systems that no longer receive long-term security support. And, unpatched infrastructure essentially leaves some of these organizations vulnerable to like attacks. We've also seen, like last year, there is a plugin called GiveWP that essentially most civil society organizations use to receive donations. And what happened last year was that a vulnerability was discovered, a critical vulnerability was discovered in this particular plugin. And what happened is that it would allow for people to actually take over your website if they exploited the vulnerability. And one of the crazy parts about this is that some organizations who use this particular plugin, some of them have not even updated to like newer recent versions where this has been patched. So we've been seeing issues around outdated software a lot. The other bit would be around weak passwords and access control. And one of the ways in which we've been seeing this a lot is, for example, from our website security perspective, the first thing we see is we saw, like, for example, an organization where every single user on their WordPress website was an admin. And some of these admin users had actually like super weak passwords. So that essentially meant that it would be very, very easy to for that to be able to be like exploited, because if someone gains access to their website, they essentially have admin they essentially have admin privileges out of the gate. So that's super dangerous in that perspective. And also we saw the aspect of like just having weak passwords and also having no two-factor authentication on critical accounts. And for websites, I think it could be something that could be overlooked. For people who, as an example, may be hosting their website on GitHub pages, then it would be very, very essential for you, as an example, to have two-factor authentication on your GitHub account so that you add that extra layer of security for your static website. And for those running WordPress, then it would be very useful to have something like a WordFence plugin that essentially would facilitate you to be able to turn on two-factor authentication and have that set up for like critical accounts such as the admin accounts. Another thing we see a lot is poor offboarding practices, and this happens in two ways. One is the aspect of former employees still having access to a website, yet they no longer work there. And the other one is contractors. So it could be like a consultant coming in to help out with content, or the actual contractor or a developer who actually set up the website still having access to the website, yet they did this project years ago. So it's very, very important to have like very good offboarding practices to remove people who no longer need access to your website, remove them completely from the website. And also another thing we see a lot is like login pages that are rate limiting, but we're going to talk about that slightly later. And then also no HTTPS. So this is simply a protocol that allows you to be able to, that allows your website and the web server in which your website is hosted to be able to communicate in a way that is safe. So for normal users, if you want to know if a website has HTTPS, you actually just have to, you'll see like something that looks like a padlock on the address space on the browser. So this is very, very important because in essence, it allows for like encryption. So users can essentially log into like a website safely and ensure that the information they're entering, for example, the username and password combination, is not easily intercepted. And even if someone tries to intercept that information, they'll get it in a way in which it's encrypted and not in plain text. So someone may not actually get access to that username and password combination. And another thing that happens now is that if our website does not have HTTPS, Google and most browsers actually will actually label that site as not secure. And one of the things that may happen from that is that people may be visiting this website and it may damage trust. And on the flip side of that is that Google essentially penalize websites that do not have HTTPS because they prioritize secure sites. So you may find yourself ranking very poorly when you should actually be doing better than that. And then we also have shared hosting as a vulnerability. So shared hosting is an instance where our web service provider hosts like multiple websites on one sort of like shared server. And in the spirit of the shared responsibility model, the expectation here is that these organizations or all these people will be responsible for handling the application layer of their websites. So making sure their plugins are safe, making sure the themes are safe. But what happens when one person out of all these people sharing a server does not update their plugin or does not update their theme? It means that they may be vulnerable, and your website, as a result of being hosted together with people who are not following security practices, may also be vulnerable as a result. So it also happens a lot. And around 10 years ago, we saw how they sort of like impacted 2,532 South African websites. There was actually like a vulnerability in a CMS called Joomla. And this essentially meant that these hackers were able to get access to a server that's hosting more than 2,500 websites. And they actually managed to deface them, to spread an agenda just because of one vulnerability on one CMS platform. So as you can see, you can start to see the ramifications of thinking about where your website is currently hosted and who you're sharing your hosting environment with. That's why for us, when you're normally giving recommendations to civil society organizations, we normally highly recommend that they default to having their own virtual private servers, especially if they're self-hosting, as opposed to using shared hosting services. But we'll get into that. We'll get more into that as well later. The other aspect is supply chain attacks. Let me just get some water. And the supply chain attack is very interesting because what normally happens is that people try to find dependencies that are commonly used by services and by platforms. And then what they try to do is that they try to compromise those plugins or those dependencies so that they essentially are able to target the users of those particular plugins or packages by default. And this is normally like a very good um, image that explains what a supply chain vulnerability could be like. Like, for example, all modern digital infrastructure is dependent on, as an example, a very a product that some random person in Nebraska has been maintaining since 2003. And one of those particular packages, as an example, would be FFmpeg. It's like a very popular audio and video encoding library that almost all streaming engines like Netflix run on. And if something ever happened to that particular library, I think so many things could go wrong just from that perspective. So, from a website security perspective, we've been seeing people actively trying to compromise plugins. And the example that we gave earlier was the Give WP plugin. And also, another trend that we've been seeing a lot is that for those plugins that have been abandoned, malicious actors are actually pretending to still maintain them, yet they're putting malicious code inside them so that they can be able to potentially attack the users of those particular plugins. And recently, we actually saw there's something called NPM, which is the Node Package Manager. So we still have like some websites that have been developed and are reliant on some NPM packages. And we saw people actually target those NPM packages to be able to compromise websites that use those packages. And I think this was a very dangerous one because the nature of this malware was that it was self-replicating, in that what it did was that the start of the attack was very small scale, but then it was jumping from one node package to another node package, and it just kept going till it got to like 180 plus. So as you can see, that's sort of like another avenue in which people get attacked. So it's constantly valuable to think about, are we using plugins that are legitimate? Are we getting updates from actually legitimate developers? And are we hosting our website in a way that is responsible? And one last piece is around large scale phishing attacks. So another thing that happened this year was that there was sort of like a controversy between the the broader WordPress community, and that what essentially happened is that WP Engine they sort of like could not stream their update process like they normally would for like their plugins. So in some instances, they actually had to give people executables or the code for some of their plugins for them to be able to keep receiving updates. And people sort of like saw what was happening there, and they started crafting phishing attacks where they were basically just trying to get people to upload malicious code onto their WordPress websites, and they were posing as, legitimate plugin providers or theme providers, and they were saying, "Hey, you currently your plugin is out of date. We have a critical security discovered there. Why don't you actually download the patch for it?" So we have the source code here for you. Please download it. This is how you can add it onto your WordPress website. And if you did this, what would happen is that they would actually take over your website almost immediately. So we saw lots of crazy things happening this year because of the WordPress drama. But yeah, now that we sort of like we understand much better the vulnerabilities, how can we sort of like protect our websites? So you can do this in multiple ways. And the first bit is access control. So just making sure that you have strong passwords on all the users of your website. So if you have something like a CMS, just make sure that every single user who has access is currently using a strong password. They're not reusing those password for like other accounts. And also, if possible, please use like a password manager. And password managers are very convenient, especially when it's like an organizational website and you may be sharing some credentials. So, we highly, highly recommend it. But if you don't use a password manager, just make sure that the password is strong. The second bit is we highly recommend that you enable two-factor authentication where possible. For example, if your website is running on Vassal, one of the ways in which you can secure it via two-factor authentication is by making sure that if you are signing into Vassal using something like GitHub, then GitHub has two-factor authentication. And if you're signing into Cloudflare for Cloudflare pages using GitHub, then just make sure that that has two-factor authentication on. And if you're using WordPress, have something like WordFence, and then make sure that your users are using the Authenticator app over SMS. And the other aspect is limit admin access. Look into your website and see who has admin rights. I think this is something you should be doing often, just that element of like user audits. And if you find X staff that are still in your website or, X volunteers or X contractors who are still there, remove them. We highly recommend that you remove them. The other bit is monitoring and detection. You can do this in three ways. So one, you can set up something we call an uptime monitor. The other thing you can set up is file change detection. The third thing is real-time monitoring, and we're actually going to go through this one by one. So this is one of the very, very good examples of a tool that we recommend. It's called Uptime Kuma. It essentially allows you to add as many websites for tracking as possible. And you get alerts when the website goes down. So, for example, if you have 5 websites set up on Uptime Kuma and one goes down, you get like an email ping like, hey, this website is down, go check up on it. And sometimes it can detect whether you're getting something known as a DDoS attack. And a DDoS attack is simply a distributed denial of service attack. And this is where people with malicious intent generate fake internet traffic onto your website, essentially overloading the resources, and it essentially renders your website in a situation where actual users may find it difficult to access it. The other thing would be file change detection. For something like WordPress, we highly recommend the WordFence plugin. It's fantastic. It actually alerts you if any of your plugins are out of date or if any sensitive file has been changed. So it will be like, I think this is like this is a potentially malicious change of a file, so please watch out for it. It also alerts you like if there's a new WordPress version and the version that you're on may be vulnerable. And another reason we like it as well is that it also alerts you if someone with like admin privileges logs in. So that just helps you keep track of that as well, like who is accessing my website and where. So it also shows like the IP address and where they're accessing it from. So that just gives you like more transparency as well with regards to who is accessing your website. For real-time monitoring, and this is for those who are self-hosting their websites. So if you have like a server where you're hosting your website from, we highly recommend like using even the free tier of net data. I think it can allow you to install up to like 5 net data agents, which means that it can fit into like 5 servers. And if you sign up for like the free tier with two different emails, you actually can get up to like 10 servers just like that. Um, so what this is very, very useful because with net data, it actually captures everything now. Like it captures the CPU spikes, it captures like the difference in trends with regards to like how much something is writing on the disk. So, as an example, if your website is actually experiencing a DDoS attack, one of the things that actually happens as well is that a lot of logging happens, and the logging is simply the action of taking note of what's happening in a server. So it's basically just writing onto like a text file, like everything that's happening. So one of the ways in which NetData works is that it checks when your website is getting its normal amount of like usage, how much do we normally write onto the disk? And now that we are getting 3 times or 4 times of usage onto this particular website, what's the change in this, what's the difference now and what's causing that difference? And are we using more CPU? Are we using more memory? Do we have memory pressure? And it essentially just gives you like a notification capturing all that information, like, hey, I think you should look into this information because this is what's happening. And it's very, very smart now. They're trying to integrate AI features into it, which I could not care less about. But as a as an agent running in your server for real-time monitoring, I don't think it gets any better than that. And then for backups and recovery, we highly recommend the 3-2-1 backup rule for your website. So have 3 copies of your website, and the first copy by default is always going to be the live website that everyone has access to. And just make sure that for the backups, have it in like 2 different storage types. One of the ways in which you can back up your WordPress website, as an example, is you could have a plugin that is connected to Google Drive, and it takes like snapshots of your website every week or every month. So you could have that cloud version, and you could also like download your website from your host and just have like a local version as well. So having one offsite backup. And if you're an organization that works in person, maybe your cloud would be your offsite backup. Or if you're a remote organization like us, then maybe the hard drive would be the offsite backup. And as I mentioned, easy ways to do this is for WordPress, and Draft Plus undoubtedly is amazing. They have like an amazing free tier. So if you don't have a backup of your website and it runs on WordPress, just go ahead and install this plugin right away. If you're using a static website, one of the best ways you can essentially back up your website is actually by using GitHub. And we highly recommend just learning how to do version control. We have so many resources on this. And one of the things we're actually going to do is, like I mentioned, we'll share with you like a tip sheet. So I'll make sure to include a resource on how to get started with GitHub. So for those who may be running static pages, you may have to go through like a 1 hour like course to understand how Git works. And then from there, I think it's just going to be like a breeze. And the most important thing is that you have to test your backups, right? So something like DigitalOcean as a cloud service provider will actually give you an option to either take a snapshot or a backup of your website. And most providers will actually give you that option for backups. So they'll take either daily backups or weekly backups or even monthly backups. So we highly recommend having those backups. Just having that option to get a backup always checked, so that in case of an incident, you can always essentially just revert back to it. And finally, if you want to protect your website against DDoS, our good friends at Cloudflare have a project called Galileo, and it's fantastic. It's free for human rights or civil society organizations or journalism organizations, and it's very easy to get yourself set up for this particular project. So I think my colleague Patricia can send out like a link to Project Galileo so that you can keep it as a resource, but we'll make sure to include it in the tip sheet as well. And just to summarize, the general protection piece is Let's Encrypt is now free, so make sure your website has HTTPS. Always keep everything up to date, keep your WordPress version or your CMS version up to date, update your plugins, update your themes, remove unused, plugins and themes because you cannot be hacked through something that you do not have. Limit login attempts to prevent brute forcing attacks. So WordFence is really, really good at this. Another thing is to secure your domain registrar account because, for example, you may use a platform such as Namecheap to register your domain, right? So you should ensure that that particular platform is like safe and secure. And also, we highly recommend that you do regular scans or vulnerability scans on your website. And we sort of like have our methodology around this. So we've been helping organizations as well to be able to keep themselves secure. And we sort of like try to look at everything, like what are the plugins, what's the hosting environment like, what are the themes being used, are they up to date? And finally, from a general protection perspective, is subscribe to these two newsletters. We have Vulnerable You and TLDRSec. We'll include the links in the tip sheet. They're fantastic. I promise you, I've subscribed to so many over the years, but a combination of these two are literally all you need to be getting consistent free intelligence on some of the tools you use and how to keep them secure or any vulnerabilities that may have surfaced against them. So we are going to wrap up the last section, and then we are going to go into Q&A really quickly. But this last session, we're just going to be speaking from three incident scenarios and how, as organizations, we can be able to like respond to them. So the first one is website defacement. And defacement is simply people of sometimes malicious intent actually being able to like post things that may be harmful to your organization onto your website. So lately we've even been seeing a lot of like organizations that do just a sec. We've been seeing, for example, CSOs getting defaced, but it's to sort of like promote like crypto scams and stuff like that. So you'll see if this happens to you, one of the telltale signs will be that there will be something strange in your homepage. And the first thing you should do is just like document, take a screenshot of it, put it in like a document, and then you can put your website in maintenance mode. For example, if it runs on a CMS. So most CMSs will let you do that, and essentially no one will be able to like access your website. And one of the other things you can do as well is just notify your hosting provider. So if you're using a managed service where they're taking care of your website and your work is just logging in there and updating a few plugins, you can just let them know like, hey, this happened. Can you help us, fix our website? And most importantly, do not panic. You have backups. Everything is going to be fine. And when it comes to recovery, again, contact hosting, your host service provider, and just let them know like, hey, this is actually happening. We would love to understand how this happened and prevent it in future. If you're self-hosting it, you may actually have to be more hands-on to do those initial incident response steps to just try and understand what may have happened to the website. If you have like a clear idea of what happened, you can feel free to like restore from a clean backup. Try to change all the passwords of the users as an example who have access to the website. And if you understand how this sort of like happened, you can patch that vulnerability. So sometimes it could just be someone got access to an admin account, and as an admin user, they just defaced the website. In other instances, it could be someone actually hacked onto the platform using like an outdated plugin. So it's just good to understand how such a thing happened and try to fix or patch that vulnerability. And keep monitoring the website in the next few weeks to just make sure that nothing else has been defaced. So this is just going to be like an intro. We're not going to go in depth, but we'll try to include resources in the tip sheet as well. The second thing would be account compromise. And this is a situation where, for example, someone received a phishing email and it looked very, very genuine and legitimate, and they put in their username and password combination onto like a malicious input by the hackers, and then they're able to like retrieve their credentials. If you suspect that this has happened, it's very, very crucial to act very quickly because all they have access to is credentials, right? So just make sure that you're changing all of the passwords immediately. And if you do not have two-factor authentication, just make sure that this has been turned on. And essentially, just make sure that you turn this on before the people with malicious intent actually did before you. But we highly always recommend that you have 2FA even before any incident in the spirit of proactive security. And just reviewing all recent changes. So WordFence, as a plugin, simply just does it all. They have something called the audit log. And this log is like super amazing. Like it breaks down any changes in users, any changes in files, any changes in the database. So if anything happened to that, you can actually just go to the audit log and it will be able to like capture any sort of like recent changes, and you should be able to adapt your approach based on the information you find on there. And check for new admin accounts, because that's one of the things that also happens as well. Like if someone breaches your website through like a plugin, the first thing they'll try to do is find a way to create a new admin account so that they can be able to do things from an admin privilege. So always check that in that particular instance and just try to remove those. And again, similar to before, just check what was accessed and try and notify any sort of like affected stakeholders or users in this particular perspective, like, hey, your account was breached for this particular reason. And there will be multiple signs of compromise on your website. And the first one would be like unusual server load. So, like I mentioned, you may see one of the things that happens when a malware is actually active on a server is that it tries to do something called data exfiltration. And this is basically just send as much data and information as possible to the people with malicious intent. So this essentially means that that is just a normal process in the server, but it actually leads to more usage of like system resources, right? So you may actually see like a spike in the CPU, and also there's something called input output reads. So you may see like another spike in that as well. In some instances, you may see like your website, you're trying to access your website and the domain is correct, but then it's just redirecting to like a shady sort of like betting website or like a crypto site or even those X-rated sites. And it can be like very frustrating in that particular moment. And if you have something like WordFence, you may see it acting up constantly, like, hey, all these strange new files are actively being created in the server. So you may see those are sort of like telltale signs to like malware on your website. And one of the ways in which this happened years ago, this is very old, but you'd be surprised how often this still works, is Amnesty International's site was compromised, and the users trying to access the site were actually being infected. Their computers were being infected by something called the ghost rat. And the rat is basically just in full, it's a remote access Trojan. And essentially what it does is that it gets into your webs into your computer, and it sometimes it's normally presented as just like an executable. Like for example, you may think you may be installing a normal application, but once it gets into your computer, its work is just to find files in a particular directory and send them to people who may have like malicious intent. Yeah, so for malware response, this can be very, very technical. And if you are self-hosting, it may be very, very difficult, but we have groups such as the Access Now's helpline who may actually help your organization. So one of the ways they'll do this is that they'll get in there and try to identify any infected files or folders. And once they sort of like have an understanding of how that happened, you simply recover your website and you find and fix the entry point of the malware itself. And also, just always important to review your security measures, especially if you're self-hosting. So just make sure that you have your firewall running and all you have like no open port that is not being used, and you just make sure that you're not accessing your server through a password, but you're using something like SSH instead. And you also have installed stuff such as RK Hunter or ClamAV, which are just powered by all these common antivirus engines that and they are able to like find malicious executables and actually be able to like contain them, right? And also fail to ban that tries to essentially stop like all these sort of like automated forms of attacks on your browser. So yeah, took 4 more minutes than actually intended, but yeah, I'm wondering if we have any questions for now.
Ryan, one of the participants asked about DDoS attacks. I think maybe you can do like remind us a little bit of what that means, because Olivia pasted some information, but I think it would be great for you to like give like a summary of what that means.
Yeah, I've actually seen Rafael who works at Equality. They also provide DDoS protection for websites. So we highly recommend Project Galileo and Equality. And Rafael, if you want to say some things about DDoS and the kind of support you provide, feel free to unmute and just say some things. But a DDoS attack is simply, I would say, like manufactured traffic onto your website. And in some instances, people may be using like some bot networks to be able to like manufacture this traffic. And they direct it onto your website so that they sort of like overload your system resources. Because one of the things that normally happens is that when you're hosting your website, your hosting service provider allocates you something called a bandwidth. Like, for example, a digital ocean droplet that's about $14 gets 1 terabyte to 2 terabytes of bandwidth, for example, every 30 days. So essentially, what happens when your website gets overloaded to a point where it experiences 10 terabytes of traffic, of manufactured traffic in an hour? That essentially means that, for example, this particular server may not have even the right resources or adequate resources to be able to serve all this traffic, right? So what essentially happens is that that server may actually go down, or the website may just be rendered inaccessible to people who may actually need to access it. So a DDoS is just overwhelming a particular website or a web platform with manufactured traffic to a sense where actual users may not be able to like use their website, or the website may be rendered inactive like temporarily.
Thank you, Brian, for the space. As you were mentioning, we in Equality provide assistance to CSOs, independent media, and individuals that works in human rights defense, providing them free services of DDoS protection and also web hosting for WordPress-based websites. But if you have your website in any other content management system, you can also use it. We have around 1,000 different organizations, media outlets, and individuals protected under Deflect umbrella. Right now, we are working with most of the media outlets around Ukraine, Palestine, and other conflicting countries right now where freedom of speech is being attacked. If you need more information or want to subscribe, you have or I put the website in the chat and also my email if you want to discuss a little more about this. And thanks for the space. If somebody has questions, yeah.
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll make sure to include equality as well in the tip sheet. So Rafael will just add your email and your details that you put in the chat onto the tip sheet. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, and I'm sorry if I moved too quickly in the session. I will try to capture as much information in the beautiful tip sheet we're going to be sharing with you. Just to make sure that you have all this information and yeah, that maybe yeah, all the information we covered here. Plus, we're going to share with you all the slides as well, so you can be able to like revisit this conversation. And another thing is that we are recording this conversation as well, so you're going to have access to the recording. So if we don't have another question, I'll hand it over to my colleague Natalie, who will be speaking about the resources beyond the tip sheet. And yeah, Natalie, take it away.
Yeah, but we do have like another question regarding to Squarespace. If you recommend that, like what you think about Squarespace. Like Lee was asking, is Squarespace a relatively secure CMS compared to WordPress? What do you think? What are your thoughts there, Ryan?
Yeah, I'd say from an ecosystem perspective, I'd refer to it as having less baggage in that you don't have to deal with a lot of like plugins or it's essentially a managed service in the form of the user simply just needs to get into the Squarespace or Wix account and just start publishing content. So in a form, a user does not have a lot of like admin overhead, right? When it comes to managing their website. So for those who, but sometimes with Wix and Squarespace, they tend to be like much more costly than, for example, having a $4 server and just having your website run off that. Like for example, on a platform like Hetzner. So I think all approaches work. It just depends on the hill you're willing to die on with regards to would I rather not deal with all these plugins but just have something that works, but then I pay like a premium for it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, just to close up this session, we want to share some resources or like more one-on-one time that you can have with members of the engine room team. We had the Katya spaces where you can book a session with me or Patricia, and if we chat with you and we figure it out and maybe you need to talk to Brian, we can do that as well. But that's like a really talk about these type of issues. It could be related to website security or safety, but also it could be about something else related to cybersecurity. It's like a one-on-one meeting, half an hour to talk about this, and we can take some notes and provide some recommendations, and maybe provide like a road that we can start to implement together. I just paste the link where you can book a Katya space with the engine room in the chat. And also we want to invite you to try the CyberCAC tool, which is the cybersecurity assessment tool, where you can answer some questions, and then based on those answers, the tool will provide some tailored recommendations to you. And then you can also book a Katya space so we can go through those recommendations and see how we can implement them together. And I think that's it. I will pass it out to Patricia to close out the session. And thank you so much for everyone that participated.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Brian, as well, for leading the session. And thank you to our participants today for your participation and all the questions that you had. Please feel free to continue reaching out to us for any support that you may need. And just a reminder that we'll be able to share the recording from this session and also the slides, and we make a beautiful tip sheets of all the takeaways from this particular session so that you can continue learning. And if you have questions based on the content that we share, please do not hesitate to reach out to us, and we will continue to support you. So thank you very much, and thank you for staying 3 minutes over time. And thank you to our interpreters as well. Thank you for being able to provide us the language accessibility to be able to reach out to more folks. So thank you very much, and have a beautiful rest of your day.